Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So this is part 13 of my user services series, and there's a couple things that I wanted to do today. Primarily, one of the things that I really want to do is work with modifying the API controller to update it to use some of those repository methods we've corrected in the last video. The other thing that I'm going to work on is also updating the base user repository. One of the things that I did in when we first developed that repository was I created an object for the repository inside that, and that allowed me to override a lot of things and do some extra stuff with just an instance of a repository or the base repository. That is okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But what I want to do is also inherit base repository into the user repository as well. And that's going to allow us a little more versatility too. Both methods are functionally correct. You could still keep doing everything the way they need to do. But as I was working on the next phase, I noticed there's just a couple things that I would really like to handle. Again, at that single point of failure at the bottom that I really don't have to deal with all the time, and sort of push some of the other logic up to the top. And that way, I don't have to manage an instance of a repository in that either. There's also a couple things that I'm going to work on today. The other one is I'm going to work on building an extension. If you recall, it's going to be for JsonDocument. Now, JsonDocument, if you recall, there's a couple functions in here where I have big long thing here where I extract a property from the JSON document. Now, that call there, that function call, is not going to be realistic in a real application. You wouldn't do this very often, and it would be really tedious to do so. So we're going to build an extension for that will extract, that will allow us to get some of those properties out in a much easier fashion, and I think you're going to like that one. The other thing that we will do is we'll do some testing today with Postman to ensure that the API functions with these new changes. And in my next video, the goal is to actually start expanding on the company's model, adding a few more properties and new entities to our database. So let's get started. All right, so one of the things that I just talked about is doing some cleanup here. So one of the things that I have is this. I have two companies controllers. I don't need the companies controllers that we created originally. This is really just doing all the things that our generic controller does. So we can actually delete that. We don't need this one anymore. So let's go ahead and remove it. The next one is I'm going to go into companies 2, and I'm just going to rename that to just companies. Once again, all these little things that we've developed, and as you're building an application along the way, you start to realize, okay, there's functionality that that I could do better. And one of the things that I often say with new programmers is just keep programming. One hard part to do is you will sometimes get into a creative block that says, I just don't want to do this anymore. Well, most of the time you get into that creative block because you're not doing it enough. It's practice, practice, practice. You got to keep going with it, and the more you do it, the better you get. You don't just learn something out of the box, out of a textbook, and say, "I've got it." You've got to apply it. You've got to apply it to real-world scenarios, and that's really why, if you looked for examples of what I'm doing today, you'll probably find a lot of examples out there that do almost identically the same thing. However, there are nuances that you do, and in your own practice, you'll start to realize that there are better ways to make things happen. So what I'm going to do again is, so I've done this little bit of housekeeping. There's a couple other little things that have been annoying me as I go into my application, and I'm going to make some changes here too. So one of the things that I wanted to do is just modify my my nav bar, so that when the user is logged in, I want to check to see if they're logged in first, and then I want to add a few new buttons to that. So if the user is authenticated, I'm going to add a few of these buttons. So we're going to do this. So I want to go to companies, and we're going to go to the index action. Okay. And the other thing that I wanted to have was a link to Swagger. Now, Swagger is a slightly different kind of link here because it's going to an HTML page. And here we just do /swagger/index.html. That way, whenever I'm testing these things, I can just easily go to them, obviously. So that's the important thing to think about here. All right, so just those couple of little things. Let's just go ahead and test this and make sure that we can actually access the way we need to. All right, so we have Swagger here, and that is working the way we expect. So let's go back to here and we'll log in, test that. Okay, we have a companies link, and we also have our companies that we expect. So right now, everything's working pretty nicely, so we can carry on with the rest of it. So let's take a look at our API controller. Now, what we did actually is I'll go into our review controller just to refresh. One of the things that we did here is we removed some of the things, some of those handlers that were setting properties inside the controller. Now, there's reasons you might want to upload that responsibility to controller. That's okay, you can do that. What we really want to do, because there's a certain let's call it a standard set of changes or updates that we want to allow on an object, and we want to push that down to the repository. So our company repository does that work. If you look at company repository now, we've added the add and update features. So we have a new entity that's been created. That new entity is passed in. The entity that is coming from the request body is coming in, we're doing the update, and then we're passing the add functionality down into the base repository, that is the base user repository. And then we're looking at the same is true for update. Now, I mentioned as well, it's tempting to override these and just sort of say, add and update do the same thing, but they actually don't, and that's why we're returning the add here. Okay, so the other thing I noticed as well is that because these are also async functions, they don't return anything. They're a void. So in fact, really all we have to be doing here is something more like that. And we just, oops, not await. We just also add the async here. And we can take away that one too. So again, as I review the code that we do, we start to recognize some things that are important to the functionality of the application. This async obviously wasn't necessary because it's not doing anything, it's not returning anything. So nothing wrong with what it did before, but it just added a task to the stack, and that's essentially how that worked. And as well, excuse me, as I'm thinking here, that's why I was looking at this green underline, thinking, what is the green underline telling me? And I just needed to await those. So nonetheless, we now have these nice overridden responsibilities. Okay. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is some of the things with our base user repository. One of the things that I did was I created an instance of an iBase repository. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, and what we did functionally works. There's nothing really wrong with it. But what I want to do is I actually want to inherit some responsibilities from BaseRepository. And to do that, we can just simply upgrade like this. Okay. Now, that allows us to remove some of the variables that we are maintaining in here, and that's really the goal. So if I comment these out, it's automatically going to say, hey, there's a few things that don't make sense anymore. And for that, I can very easily now push this down to the base, okay? And again, looking at some of the responsibilities here, I have to think about what each one of these things actually does. So in the add, I'm actually overriding the base because I'm doing something slightly different than what the base does. If I go into the implementation here at the base repository level, oops, hang on a second, am I going to the right one? Base repository key. Okay, do we have an add here? We don't, and that's down. That is why it went down to the bottom. So at the bottom level here, all it does is just take us to this context.add. Okay, and the only difference that we're doing by doing the override in our user context is we just ensure that we have a user. If it doesn't have a user, it's going to throw an error, and that's exactly what we're aiming for. Delete will do something similar. Now, functionally, what I'm doing here, it doesn't really have to be done like this. I could actually push this down to the base implementation as well. And again, this will be in. I'm not going to do this one, but yeah, okay. So I've got it going to the delete here in the user repository. Once again, some of that functionality can be pushed down, but based on the order of process that we have, the test for whether an entity is null always has to be at the top. Okay. The next test is, hey, do we actually have an ID that works? The other test that we should be testing for as well is, do we have a user ID on this entity? And then as well, is that user the same user that is in the underscore user ID? So there's a couple of things that could be tested here, and really what we're doing when we think about the order of operations here, we generally don't call delete first. So we generally we'll call it like this. We'll say, get me an object with an ID, and that ID should also relate to the current user. Okay, so if it's found, great, then we find it and then we go down into deleting it. Okay, so we're assuming that by this point it actually has a user ID, but you could add some more checks to ensure that there's actually a user ID available. All right, now let's go through here and make sure that we're doing our overrides too. So we'll do override there. And with delete, we'll put an override there because we're overriding these at the bottom level. Now, our exists does nothing different than the base. So what I'm going to do here is just comment that out. Same with find. Find really doesn't do anything different here. And I think what I'm going to do is remove that one as well, because I don't believe that's too necessary as also, because we're not doing anything that requires the user. Our get, same thing. We don't need that. And you can see right now that we're getting an error here. Now, one of the things that I could do with this method, I could actually call the get and pass in a query, but because of the way we're doing it now, I actually have to call get all and then do a where statement. Okay, so That because it's overriding at the context level at this point, doing a where statement isn't a terrible idea. So we can override that, and that's because every time we do a get of some sort, we're actually calling this method. So if we called get, it would get into a cyclic redundancy, and then we wouldn't be able to do the work that we're looking for. So that is the reason we have to override get, because it injects this check for the user ID. Let's move down, and that one is actually an override as well. Let's see, we do not need to override save changes, so we can get rid of that. Has user, set user, get user ID. Update. Update does need to be overridden. Okay. And that, once again, is because we're ensuring that we actually have an ID on the entity, and that's an important thing to consider. Both of these fines, we don't need them to be the way they are either. And one of the things that I did over here is I overrode the add function, and sort of brought it up one level. And one of the things that we could do with the new model is just keep it the way it is, because that add method at the bottom level actually goes down, and then if add is overridden, it pops back up to user and then goes back down into the base level. So I can comment that out safely. Again, there's nothing different that we're doing here, so if we don't have to do anything with this, we don't really need to worry about it at all. Same with update. We had that update that was up here, and we're ensuring the user context. Just as a level of safety, we just want to make sure that we're doing that as well. Okay, and let's see, we'll go to, we don't need to do this one. Okay, and delete. There is nothing unique about these that the lower level does. So there are other checks that you can add within this. I would say that we're probably 80% safe on this for the majority of use cases that we have. If you really need to tighten down everything or every step of the way, you can feel free to do that. But for brevity, I don't think we need to make those changes. All right. So now that we've done that, we're going to go into our base user repository and actually start making some of the changes that I wanted to do. Okay, so lots of little things that you have to think of before you get to the point of making these upgrades. But you're going to see that because of these upgrades, we didn't really have to change any logic throughout the application, and that's good because of the way we designed this. The logic is inside that repository, but the definition of the functions and methods, nothing changed. So, all right, so let's think about some of the things that need to be changed here. One of the things that I did definitely see, and I caught an error once, was this. So if entities equals null, we have to throw a bad request. So we do most common errors there. So we can throw a bad request here. And because we're adding a new response code, we have to add produces response type. So I'm going to go down and steal one of those response types from down in our put. And go back up here. Okay, there we go. Move that up. Take away that. Take away that. All right. So, and because of the way we've set up our response types too, with giving examples of response types, any additional produces response types that we add are automatically going to be produced the way we need them to as well. All right, let's move down into our get. Now, get also will also produce this bad response. So I'm going to do the same thing here. If entity equals null, then return bad request. Okay, and once again, because of the fact that we have these, we can take that and put that up there. Great. All right, so we are adding this bad request to our get with an ID. We want to make sure that we have this test to know that if we have a null entity coming back, there's a lot of reasons it could be null, but one could be that the ID is not correct for the user, or the ID just doesn't work. What we should do as well is just double check that we actually have an ID. So we say if ID equals default, then we also can do a bad request. Okay, we don't have to add anything extra to that. With an API, it's okay sometimes to throw an error. However, you want to be somewhat descript on the other end, because one of the things that I often will do is I'll wrap all of my responses into some sort of standard object, sort of standard response. That way, I can almost always return something to the end user that is consistently usable. It would be like the status that would actually be changing, rather than that way they can still receive something, but ultimately that's what you're kind of hinging on. If you return a bad request, the object that's returned is very different than an OK, where you're sending some other data through. All right, let's pass through here. Okay, so let's look at the bulk of the stuff that we really want to focus on, okay? With our post, one of the things that we've done here is we've taken a good route of using the JSON document. I like this method because it provides a lot of flexibility that could come into the body of the request. There's always, pros and cons to this. I've weighed this out and I've realized that based on the way I do it, I can be fairly type safe. If you are using something like a mapper, for example, that you just freely map anything that's coming over into your object, you could end up with some challenges. So you do have to be aware of what you're pulling in. And that's why when we're building this, we've got a lot of control about what comes into our object, or basically what we're allowing into that object. So one of the things that I like to do in this case is, I mentioned earlier, I'm going to build an extension, but I'm going to show you what that extension actually is supposed to do here. So in this case, one of the things that we can do here is we can pull in the JSON that's actually being consumed by the JSON document itself. Because remember, we're sending in JSON, it's converting it to an object. That object also has JSON, the JSON version of what we were passing in. So I can convert that out back to a string. And then what I can do is I can start to work with the JSON deserializer. So in this case, I can actually produce, I'm going to use a nullable T. I can produce a model from what came into that JSON. So with this JSON serializer, I can do a JSON deserialize, model it as a T, and I can just pass in the JSON string. That gives me a nullable model, and I can test for null. So in this case, if model equals null, I want to return bad request. Once more. Oops, I gotta learn to type return. There we go. All right, so I can return bad requests, which means I want to also add in more information around the requests once more. So we'll do that. You want to sort of keep track of all the requests or responses that you're providing to your end user. All right, now with that, one of the things that the deserializer does, and it doesn't do it very well, in my opinion, I kind of think it should do this by default, but what it does is it looks at exactly the model that you're trying to convert it to, and it says, name equals name, and here's the value that's going into the name property. But if you recall, the way you often will post something, people will use a key of, let's use name as the example. You have a capital N as a camel case. Maybe you have lowercase, maybe you have uppercase. Maybe you just didn't care and you're just like typing randomly name with a whole bunch of different cases. These are the things that come into to APIs a lot of times, and the more mistakes that people make, the obvious things is that that you could simply deal with them by just ignoring the fact that they made a mistake and making them fix their problem. Or you can add a couple lines of code that simply ignore case altogether. And if you recall, one of the things that we did in our post method, actually we can see right here, we had to do that. We did this long code for ignoring case. So with the JSON deserializer, one of the great things about this, and I love some of the things that we can do with the JSON serialization options, is we can do something like this, where I can say case insensitive equals true. So by setting it to case insensitive equals true, I can now pass in those options, and it will ignore the case that's coming in through the JSON document and just try to map as best as possible to that model. Anything it doesn't get, well, there's probably a problem with the model anyhow, and that's when you should be returning something of a bad request. You could do some more validation here as well. You can add some sort of validator to say, hey, do we actually have a valid name property? You can add that valid, and it's probably worth adding fluent validation into your objects as well. It's another great way to consider using that in terms, especially as an API controller. But let's consider what we have to do now to our API. So we now have a T that's coming in. Okay, we have a new entity that we're going to map model into entity. Okay, so from this, if you recall, we have in this case, if we think of the context of our company repository, we can just pass model in now. And because one of the things that we don't want to break here is we have this post pre-add handler, and it takes an entity and the JSON document. Well, now what we want to do is have one that takes the model as well. We don't have one like that, so we're going to go ahead and create that. So we'll just go down to where this pre-add handler is, and I'm just going to make a copy of it. So, looks like this. And once again, all we're doing here is, and I'll give you a little prototype here just so that anybody trying to use this could actually go in and say, I see how it's used. All right, so it looks something like this. This is much cleaner than what we had up here with our JSON document property extraction. And that's really the effort that we're aiming for. So why would I want to keep this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain times when you might push more information into your JSON body. And for whatever reason, you may want to do that, but I've had times when I've wanted to do that, and it's like, okay, this is a perfect opportunity for it. It doesn't match the model, but I can still push it in because I've got this nice JSON document that will allow me to do that, and I can pass information around. Something like a view model for an API, okay? Now, that's great. We've got that adjusted. So let's go back up to our post method. So we have our add, and if you want to, what I'll do is here is I'm going to go down into our company just to refresh your memory on what I'm doing here. At this point, I have it setting the name, just like I was showing in the example, and same with the update. So the update's going to be basically the same thing. So I'm going to be making those updates too. And I think we have this one fairly well covered. So let's see what happens here. Let's go down to our put. Now, one mistake that I made, and I don't know why I made this, is I put this entity not equal to null. So basically, anytime we would run through the put, it actually should have errored out. So my apologies on that. Now we have something that throws if there's an error here anyway, and I can keep this key not found. That's not a bad idea. But for the sake of sort of handling errors the way I want in this, is I'm going to remove it, and you can keep it. You don't have to change anything. It'll still work great, and you can still throw errors the way you need. But I'm going to remove it just for the sake of the future videos. And I'm just going to give this a couple lines here and clean up the code. All right, so the same goes through with what we did up here. When we converted our JSON document to a model. Now, you can see that we're going to reuse this functionality. And one of the things that I absolutely love about using C# is extensions. So I'm going to start creating some extensions that I commonly use throughout my application development. So with this, I'm going to create an extension. An extension is a static class. I'm going to call this JSON extensions. Okay, JSON extensions. There we go. Okay, so it's going to be a public. Static is going to be the return. It's going to be returning a T nullable, just like I had before. I'm going to call this extension convert2. We're going to require a T to come in. We are going to extend on the JSON document. All right. And I'm going to tell this method what a T actually can be, and that has to be a class. All right. So with that, we can go back over to our API. And if I go up to my code right here, I can actually take this code out and I'm going to put it into my extension. Before I go ahead, I can add in some null validations. So we say if value equals null, oops, not value task, equals null, oh, and it's not value, it's document. There we go. Then we want to throw a new null reference argument null. There we go. All right, so and we have document. There we are. All right, so with this, we're just doing a double check to see if we have a null document. If we do, we're going to return. Otherwise, let's go through and process, and we can return that result. So the cool thing is that I can eliminate several lines of code here, push it down into an extension, and I can reuse it now. This is a good example of an extension because it's something that's easily reusable. It's duplicatable. Every time you use it, it should give you a very consistent result. You would want to add in some other testing here, maybe a try catch as well, but I'm not going to go that deep on this one. So let's go into this here. We can make this change now. And all we have to do here is do convert to T, and we pass in, actually we don't have to pass in anything, and there we go. All right, so that eliminates a big bunch of code. And that means that now I can go down and into my put, and I can eliminate this code by doing just that. And based on our naming conventions, it's easy to remove the model ID. And there we have it. So the other test that I want to do is also test whether we have a model. And if model equals null, then we also want to respond with bad request. All right. So that way, we've got a model that we can work with. We've got an ID that we can cross-reference, looking for equality. The next thing we do is we go off and see if we have an entity on the database based on the user. If we have that, we're doing well. We can now go into our post find handler, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did for the not post but put find handler, and this one is going to be the same as before in the post. This variable name will be current. Okay, so I'll give an example once more. Entity.name, and then there we have it. All right, so now with that, I can update this to ensure that I actually have our model changes coming in. And once again, just so you're familiar, this allows us to push up to the controller level. Okay, the controller may have very specific things that it has to do to that model before it comes in, or those changes come into the entity. Next, I have another one that allows me to make changes based on what the model has in it. And then I'm going to actually run an update from the repository. So repository.update, and this will provide those, yet again, standardized changes throughout the application. Anywhere that's using the repository will also receive the changes. So there's three areas here that we're providing a user to run those updates. This is important once again because you can push the responsibility up to the level of, let's say, a junior programmer who's programming this company's controller. As you can see, there's a lot of things that we can actually eliminate now. We don't need these handlers here because they are handled by the repository. So we can actually delete that one. The put entity handler, the put find handler. Let's just make sure that we've got this here in the right spot. Put post find handler. That goes to the post handler, and we can delete that one because we actually removed that responsibility once more. So we can eliminate code over here and add code over here, but by adding it into the repository in the lower levels, it makes it a lot less code at the bottom. Someone was saying the other day, well, I built this application and it actually added code, and that's not technically correct. If you're only one-to-one, if you got the company's controller, for example, and a base controller, this base controller is going to handle a lot of things that are very standard. But as you add more endpoints, you're going to see you have far less code to manage, and that's the goal ultimately of a great, really software lead, is to reduce the amount of code that they're managing. Now, I mean, if your goal is to have a job where you're just maintain your job because you've produced so much bad code, that can happen too. So, if your goal is that, well, you'll probably keep your job just fine. So let's look down into our repository or our API generic controller again. And I think we've pretty much handled the majority of things in our put here. Let's go down. We'll just make sure that our delete is doing what it's supposed to as well. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do is you can, one of the things that we should do, actually, I'll do this right now, is add a handler that handles things before the delete in the repository. Okay, so the repository itself will have specific things that may be required for, let's say, the companies. So as I add to the company's model in the next video, you're going to see that there's going to be need to delete, let's say, collections or other objects that are related to this before you actually delete the object itself. So let's imagine I added employees. I'd have to delete the employees lists or collection first, and then actually delete the company itself. So I'm going to do something like that. So I'll do a delete pre-delete handler. Okay. And I can pass in the entity, okay, and we'll generate that method just like that. That will be a protected. All right, and we don't have it doing anything, but if it ever had to, we would have the ability now. So now we have a virtual method that can be called before the delete. Once again, that could handle deleting of external entities. But the key is we've offered it up to the end user to have some extra functionality that might be really super helpful. All right. I think we're ready to give this a test, so let's give it a try here. Okay, so let's try and access companies, and we're good. We still have the ability to do our edit. Let's just be sure of that. Looking good here. Go back to the list, and again, I want to do lots of tests and make sure that I have everything that I need working the way it should. Good. And just so I'm not hiding something from you, one thing I did notice, and I will admit, when I loaded this up and tested it in my break there, I forgot to add base.getAll into this repository. So if I just kept it as get all the way it was, it's going to get into a cyclic redundancy, and we don't obviously want that. We want to call the base get all, which is going down into the base repository. All right, so there's that. So when we go into testing this into Postman now, we've got a few tests that we're going to run on the CRUD tests and a login. So we'll go ahead and run this and get us up and running in Postman. So we have all of our tests passing through. We log in, we post a new one, a new company in this case. We put the company, we change the name in this case. We go off and get a list of companies. Then we looked up the company that we posted and put here, and then we delete that entity. So how do I do that? Let's go into each method here, and I'll show you what I'm doing. So in post, I have a test that's run after this is created, and I simply look to see what's the ID of the post that came back, what's the response. I take that ID and I put it to a collection variable name, last post. Fairly straightforward. My body looks quite simple. I always have a timestamp that I send in as well, and that's a little JavaScript that runs in the background too. When I run that, you'll see that I have a new entity that comes back. This ID will be stored, and if I go into put, you'll see the result of the last post, and it'll be right here. Okay, you can see my variable right there. So I pass in the last post as a variable into ID. I also pass it into the ID area for sending that data to the API. And then, of course, name, I'm passing in testing, and I update the timestamp. So if I go and send that, I receive a response of OK, and I've updated testing once again. I go off here and I say, get me all of the companies in my list, and I can also get that list of companies. Once more, I'll go off and ask for a specific company by ID, and that ID once again is using the last post variable. I can access that fairly easily. And finally, we do a delete. And there we go. We have a response of 200, which means that if I try to run get by ID again, it should give me a bad request. And it does. Okay, so we're responding exactly the way we're expecting. We're getting everything that we need from our API, and all these nice little upgrades that we've done have expanded now our ability to start expanding our models. And that's the thing that I'm going to work in my next video. So I hope you like what I'm doing here. These videos have a lot of content, a lot of detail, and I'm also showing some of the mistakes that we can make along the way as our thought process improves. The goal ultimately is to show you as a new programmer or someone who's a .NET enthusiast to dig in and figure some stuff out that may make your programming work a lot more effective and more usable, hopefully. So remember to like and share. I love you guys. Comment lots. Tell me what you need to see, what you want to see. Be kind, be gentle. Love you. Bye.